Most people who saw the modest brick house on Sycamore Street assumed the woman who lived there alone was exactly what she appeared to be. A quiet 67-year-old widow who kept to herself, tended her roses, and hadn't bothered anyone in the 12 years since her husband passed. They saw the graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, the careful way she walked to her mailbox each morning, the faded station wagon she drove to the grocery store once a week. They saw ordinary. They saw harmless. They saw someone who wouldn't fight back. What they didn't see was the locked garage behind her house, the one she visited every single day, running her weathered hands over chrome and leather that still smelled faintly of road and rain. They didn't see the vest hanging on the wall inside, patches worn but pristine, the words stitched across the back in bold letters that once commanded respect across 6 states. Hell's Angels, Vice President. And they definitely didn't see the phone tree that vest still carried weight on, a network of brothers who remembered Thomas Reaper Calloway not as history, but as family. The trouble started on a Thursday night in late September when 4 teenagers, bored and reckless in the way only small-town kids with nothing to lose can be, decided Margaret Calloway's detached garage looked like an easy target. They'd been drinking behind the old lumber yard, daring each other into stupidity, when Tyler Kinsef, 17, and convinced the world owed him something, pointed toward the Calloway property and said he'd heard the old woman kept expensive tools locked up in there. His friends, Danny Rourke, Mason Wells, and Kyle Peterson, barely hesitated. They'd done this before. Mailbox baseball, broken windows, spray paint on cemetery walls, small-town vandalism that rarely resulted in more than a lecture because their parents knew the right people and made the right donations. Margaret Calloway lived alone. She was old. She wouldn't chase them, wouldn't identify them, wouldn't matter. They waited until nearly midnight before creeping across her back lawn, flashlights off, boots crunching softly through fallen leaves. The garage sat 50 feet behind the main house, its overhead door facing away from the street, perfect for what they had planned. Tyler pulled a crowbar from his backpack while Mason kept watch, and within seconds they'd jimmied the side door lock and slipped inside. The beam of Tyler's flashlight swept across the dark interior, landing first on a workbench cluttered with oil cans and rags, then across a pegboard hung with tools that looked older than any of them. But it was what sat in the center of the garage, covered by a heavy tarp, that made Tyler grin. Something big. Something worth taking or destroying. He grabbed the edge of the tarp and yanked it free. Beneath it sat a 1972 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, black and chrome, immaculate despite decades of age. Its leather saddlebags were embossed with a winged skull. Its gas tank bore hand-painted flames that seemed to flicker even in the dim light. And hanging from the handlebars was a faded bandana tied in a specific knot that any rider would recognize instantly. But these weren't riders. They were kids drunk on adrenaline and beer who saw only an old motorcycle they could wreck for fun. "Dude, check this out," Kyle whispered, already reaching for one of the mirrors. Tyler raised the crowbar and brought it down hard across the headlight. Glass exploded. The sound cracked through the night like a gunshot. Then Danny kicked the front fender, denting the metal, while Mason grabbed a can of spray paint and began tagging the fuel tank with crude letters. They were laughing now, too loud, too confident, certain the old woman sleeping in the house wouldn't hear or wouldn't care. They smashed the speedometer, snapped off the clutch lever, tore the bandana, and threw it on the floor. By the time they finally stumbled back out into the night, the garage looked like a crime scene, and the motorcycle that had once carried a Hell's Angels vice president. Across half the country lay violated and broken in the dark. What none of them noticed, too drunk and stupid to look up, was the small security camera mounted in the corner rafter. The red recording light blinking steadily, with the fact that Margaret Calloway wasn't asleep at all. She was standing at her kitchen window, phone already in hand, staring at the garage with an expression that wasn't fear or panic. It was something colder, something patient. Because Margaret had buried her husband 12 years ago, but she had never buried his memory. And the brothers who had stood beside his grave, men with road names like Grave, Steel, and Hammer, had made her a promise that day. "If you ever need us," they'd said quietly, "you call." Margaret pulled up a contact in her phone that she hadn't used in over a decade. Her thumb hovered over the name for only a second before pressing dial. 300 miles away, a phone buzzed on a nightstand in a roadside motel. A massive hand reached out and answered. Grave, the voice rumbled. Margaret's voice was steady, calm, but beneath it ran something sharp as broken glass. They touched Reaper's bike. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the voice came back, low and absolute. We ride at dawn. By the time the sun crept over the hills east of Maplewood, the sound was already building. Low at first, distant, a mechanical thunder that seemed to rise from the highway itself, growing louder with every passing minute until the entire town could feel it vibrating through windows and floorboards like the approach of something inevitable. Margaret Calloway stood in her driveway, arms folded across her chest, gray hair still pinned neatly despite the early hour. She'd been awake all night, not from fear, but from memory. She'd sat in the garage beside Reaper's broken motorcycle, running her fingers over the shattered headlight and dented chrome, and she'd allowed herself something she rarely did anymore. She'd cried, not for the machine, but for the man who had loved it, the man who had built it with his own scarred hands, the man who had ridden it to her door every single day for 30 years until his heart finally gave out on a quiet Sunday morning in that very garage. Thomas Reaper Calloway had been a hard man, a man whose name carried weight in places polite society preferred to ignore. But he had loved Margaret with a fierce, unshakable loyalty that never wavered, and when he died, his brothers had told her she wasn't just Reaper's widow. She was family, forever. Now, as the rumble grew deafening, she watched the first motorcycle crest the hill at the edge of town, then another, then 10 more, then a flood of them, rolling in formation down Sycamore Street like a river of black leather and chrome, engines growling in perfect unison as they filled the quiet neighborhood with a sound it had never heard before. Curtains twitched in nearby windows. Neighbors stepped onto porches, eyes wide. Someone across the street pulled out a phone and started recording. Because Maplewood had never seen anything like this. 20, 30, 40 motorcycles, all bearing the same patch across their backs. Hell's Angels. The lead rider pulled to a stop directly in front of Margaret's driveway and cut his engine. The man who climbed off was enormous, easily 6'4", with a gray beard that reached his chest and hands like weathered iron. His vest carried more patches than anyone else's, and when he removed his helmet, his eyes found Margaret immediately. Maggie, he said quietly, his voice rough but gentle. Grave, she replied, and the tension in her shoulders finally eased. Behind him, the other riders dismounted in silence. Veterans, all of them. Men and women who had ridden with Reaper decades ago and still carried his memory like a banner. They moved toward the garage without needing to be told, and when they saw what had been done to the shovelhead, the air itself seemed to tighten. One rider, a lean man with a scarred jaw called Hammer, knelt beside the bike and ran his hand over the broken mirror. They knew what this was. Margaret shook her head. Just kids. Stupid kids. Grave turned toward her, his expression unreadable. You got them on camera? She nodded and handed him a USB drive. All 4. Clear faces. He pocketed it without a word. Then he looked back at the garage, at the wreckage of a machine that had been more than metal and gasoline. It had been a shrine, a memory, a brother's legacy. We'll handle this, Grave said simply. Margaret started to speak, then stopped. She knew what handle this meant in their world. But before anyone could move, a Maplewood police cruiser rolled slowly up the street. Lights off, but presence unmistakable. The officer behind the wheel was Chief Roy Dempsey, a man in his late 50s who'd spent 30 years keeping the peace in a town that rarely needed much keeping. He parked at the curb and stepped out slowly, his hand nowhere near his weapon but his posture careful. He'd seen the recordings. He'd gotten the call. And he knew exactly who these riders were. Morning, Chief, Grave said evenly. Dempsey nodded. Grave, been a long time. It has. The chief glanced toward the garage, then back at the rows of motorcycles. I heard what happened. Saw the footage Margaret sent. Over. We've already identified the boys. I'm heading to their houses this morning to bring them in. Grave's jaw tightened. That's so. Dempsey met his eyes without flinching. It is. This is my town, Grave. My jurisdiction. And those kids are going to answer for what they did. But it's going to be done legal. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension stretched thin as wire. Then Margaret stepped forward, placing a hand on Grave's arm. Roy's right, she said quietly. Reaper wouldn't want it any other way. Grave exhaled slowly, then nodded once. All right, but we're staying until it's settled. Dempsey didn't argue. He simply tipped his hat toward Margaret and walked back to his cruiser. By noon, all 4 boys were sitting in the Maplewood Police Department. Their parents called. Their bravado shattered the moment they realized the old woman they'd targeted wasn't defenseless at all. And outside the station, 40 motorcycles sat parked in perfect formation, engines silent, but presence louder than any threat ever spoken. Because the message was clear. Margaret Calloway wasn't alone. She never had been. And the memory of Thomas, Reaper, Calloway still carried weight in a world where loyalty never expires. The inside of the Maplewood Police Department had never felt smaller. Tyler Kinseth sat hunched in a plastic chair, his hands shaking despite his best efforts to look tough, while his mother paced furiously behind him and his father stood silent near the wall, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Across the room, the other 3 boys sat with their own families, everyone avoiding eye contact, the weight of what they'd done finally sinking in now that 40 Hells Angels were parked outside, and the evidence was undeniable. Chief Dempsey stood at the front of the room, arms folded, his expression carved from stone. He'd been a cop long enough to recognize the exact moment kids realized they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. And judging by the pale faces in front of him, that moment had arrived. You boys thought you were smashing up some old lady's junk, Dempsey said quietly. But what you actually destroyed was a memorial. That motorcycle belonged to Thomas Calloway, Reaper, vice president of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club for over 20 years. A man who commanded respect across 6 states. A man who died 12 years ago and whose brothers still honor his memory. Tyler's mother inhaled sharply. Mason Wells started to cry. Carl Peterson stared at the floor like he wanted it to swallow him whole. Dempsey continued. Mrs. Calloway has every right to press full charges. Vandalism, destruction of property, breaking and entering. And given the value of what you destroyed, we're talking felonies. You'd be looking at time in juvenile detention, criminal records that follow you into adulthood, and a civil lawsuit that would bankrupt your families. The room went silent except for the sound of Mason's muffled sobs. Then Dempsey's voice softened slightly. But Mrs. Calloway didn't come here asking for that. Every head in the room lifted. What she wants, Dempsey said, is for you to understand what you did. Not just the crime, the disrespect, the cruelty of destroying something that can't be replaced. So here's what's going to happen. He gestured toward the door. You're going to walk outside. You're going to apologize to Mrs. Calloway and to every single rider out there. And then you're going to spend the next 6 months of your weekends working in her yard, repairing her garage, and helping restore that motorcycle under the supervision of the same men you disrespected. You'll learn what it means to earn back trust. And if you complete that without complaint, Mrs. Calloway has agreed not to press charges. Tyler's father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. And if they refuse? Dempsey's expression hardened. Then I book them right now, and they take their chances in court. 20 minutes later, the 4 boys stood on the sidewalk in front of the police station, the September sun too bright, the air too still, and the line of motorcycles too close. Margaret Calloway stood near the center of the group, her expression unreadable, while Grave and the others watched in silence. Tyler stepped forward first, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Calloway, I'm sorry. We didn't know. You didn't care, Margaret corrected quietly. But you're going to learn to. One by one, the boys apologized. Some of the words were clumsy. Some were tearful. None of them were adequate. But Margaret nodded each time, accepting what they offered because she understood something about second chances that her late husband had taught her long ago. People could change, if someone made them. Grave stepped forward then, towering over the boys like a mountain. You'll report to Mrs. Calloway's house every Saturday at 8 a.m. You'll work until the job's done, and you'll do it right. Because if I hear you disrespected her even once, I'll make sure you regret it in ways your parents can't protect you from. Understood? For heads nodded quickly. Good, Grave said. Then his voice softened just slightly. Reaper believed in second chances. But only one. Don't waste it. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. The boys showed up every Saturday as promised. At first they worked in sullen silence, raking leaves and repairing the garage door under the watchful eyes of Hammer and 2 other riders who took turns supervising. But slowly, as weeks passed, the silence gave way to questions. Carl asked Hammer how to properly torque a bolt. Mason asked about the patches on the vests. Tyler, the ringleader, asked Margaret one morning why she was giving them a chance at all. Margaret handed him a rag and pointed toward the shovel head, which was slowly being restored piece by painstaking piece. Because my husband believed people were more than their worst mistakes, she said simply. And I believe he was right. By the time winter arrived, the garage had been fully repaired, the yard immaculate, and the shovel head, though still incomplete, gleaming with new chrome and fresh paint. The boys had logged over 200 hours of work, and somewhere along the way, they'd stopped seeing Margaret as a target and started seeing her as a person. Someone who had lost something irreplaceable and chosen grace over vengeance. On the final Saturday, Grave returned with a small group of riders to inspect the work. He walked through the garage slowly, running his hand over the restored motorcycle, then turned to the boys. "You did good," he said. And from a man like Grave, those 3 words carried the weight of absolution. Margaret invited everyone inside for coffee. The boys sat awkwardly at first, surrounded by men whose reputations still made them nervous. But Grave told stories about Reaper, about long rides and hard lessons, and the kind of loyalty that didn't fade with death. And the boys listened. When it was time to leave, Tyler lingered on the porch. "Mrs. Calloway," he said quietly, "I know this doesn't fix what we did, but thank you for not giving up on us." Margaret smiled faintly. Reaper wouldn't have. So neither did I. As the motorcycles rolled out of Maplewood that afternoon, the sound was different than it had been months earlier. Not a warning this time. A farewell. And Margaret stood in her driveway, watching them disappear over the hill, knowing her husband's memory had done something he would have been proud of. It had turned 4 reckless kids into young men who understood that respect wasn't given. It was earned. And sometimes, the hardest lessons came wrapped in second chances you didn't deserve but were given anyway. She walked back into the garage and rested her hand on the shovelhead's tank, still warm from the afternoon sun. "We did good, Thomas," she whispered. "We did real good." And somewhere, on a long highway that stretched beyond sight, she liked to believe he was riding still.